Thank you, Lauren, and thank you for your encouraging words earlier. No pressure. But it's great to see everybody. I've been away for 2 weeks, and this is my first day back, and it's nice to see some familiar faces. And yeah, so last week, Margaret, you were speaking on this. So the question we've been looking at is, does age matter? An age-old question. See what I did there? So I wasn't able to see Margaret's talk last week, but I'm sure it was fantastic. But Margaret, you looked at Sarah, and I'm sure you did an amazing job to come to a conclusion about what does age matter? Does it affect us? And in what way does it affect us? Are you guys good? Cool. Next slide, please. So age matters in a lot of different areas. So if you want to drink, you have to be 18 years old to buy alcohol. If you want to drive a car, you have to be 17 years old to pass your test. If you want to get married, only recently, you have to be 18 years old to get married. So yeah, age does matter in some spheres of life. But I guess what we're trying to answer, what does it mean for us as people of God? What does it mean? Does your age matter? Does it affect you? Does it make you less or more equipped for the call of God? So in order to answer that, we're going to look at David. Now, we covered David probably multiple times throughout the entire year on different subjects. So we're going to do it again today, and we're going to look at it from this aspect. Did his age matter? Was he a king at a young age, or did he become a king later on? So David, we know his story, but I'm going to go through a little synopsis just in case there's somebody in the room who doesn't know it. So Israel gets a king. His name is Saul. Now, God is not very happy with this king, Saul, and he's kind of disappointed in the fact that he's not following in the ways of God. He's not listening to God. He starts believing his own hype, and he kind of takes Israel down this direction of not having a very good spiritual leader. So God is very upset with this scenario, and he sets another king in place. And he sets Samuel on the task. Samuel was a prophet at the time, and God says to Samuel, I know this guy, I want to make king, and his name is David. He's the son of Jesse, lives in Bethlehem. Go there, see his dad, anoint him. And Samuel was not very happy about this. I think he kind of likes Saul a bit, and he's upset about it. But he goes anyway. And he goes to Bethlehem, and he finds Jesse, and Jesse got 8 sons, as you did back then. And David is the youngest one of the 8. So Samuel gets Jesse to bring all of his sons to him, and Jesse does this, and he starts going through them one by one. And it starts with the oldest one, and that's the one that Samuel thought was going to become king. But God's like, no, although he's strong and he's tall and he's got all the features, but he doesn't have the heart. I'm looking at the heart of the person. So Samuel goes through the kids one by one until he gets to David. David is the youngest one of the lot, and God's like, yep, that's my guy, anoint him. And Samuel does this, and Samuel then goes off, and then also David goes back to being a shepherd king. And in the moment where Samuel anoints him, it's said that David is filled with the Holy Spirit in a mighty way, and that kind of begins his ministry. And he goes back to being brilliant. And then next one, please. I'm a bit behind. And sorry, no, go back. That's my bad. Great, thank you. So David goes back to being this shepherd king. And while he's there, I don't know exactly what would have been going through his head. Maybe he would have been thinking about the stories from back in the day, maybe stories of Samson, maybe stories of the people that came behind him, Egyptians and beating the Egyptians, Exodus. And there must have been a lot going through his head as he went back to being a shepherd boy after being anointed to being the next king of Israel. Now, later on, Saul's at war with the Philistines, and that's something they did quite regularly back then. They were like the main arch enemy of Israel. So Saul goes to war with the Philistine, but again, because he's lost his edge, he's not the spiritual leader he once was, he's unable to kind of progress in this war. So they camped opposite each other. Saul's on one side, the Philistines on one side, and nothing seems to be happening. Then this kind of giant of the man called Goliath comes from the Philistine camps, and he kind of makes his declaration and says, basically, send somebody from your camp to fight me. And if they win, then your people must become our subjects. And if I win, then, did I say that right? You know what I'm trying to say. Basically, whoever wins, they will become subjects of the other camp. Nobody turns up to this. Nobody rises up to the occasion. And this goes on for 40 days. So every day, Goliath will come out and make this sort of grand speech, and nobody will come forward. Saul didn't go. Nobody else in the camp went out. They were kind of terrified. They lost the edge. They were fighting with their own might and looking at their own strengths and their own biceps and their own swords and thinking, we don't match up to this guy. And Saul doesn't seem to have any remedy for this. So this goes on for 40 days. And then Jesse says to David, go and take some grain for your brother. And David goes off, takes the grain to his brothers. And then when David comes to the camp and he hears the stories and he sees Goliath, and Goliath comes out and gives one of these grand speeches that he got used to giving every day. And David hears this. And David is filled with rage. Up to this point, we've kind of had this image of kind of a sweet kid. He likes music. He's a shepherd boy. He's got a good heart. And that's the image we have of him, that he's just a sweet kid. He's a godly kid. But all of a sudden, we're kind of faced with this different side of David. So David sees Goliath, and he's kind of filled with rage. And he goes, who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? And in David's head, kind of after the fact that he was anointed, and after going back and kind of meditating on what does that mean, he's got this edge to him. He's I don't know whether it's the Spirit of God that's kind of boiling up inside of him, this anger, this righteous anger, or whether he's just a maniac. I'm not really sure. But basically, he's outraged by this. And he makes this statement, and he keeps going on about it, and his brothers are like, no, shut up. And he kind of carries on. Eventually, Saul kind of finds out about this, and he gets taken to Saul. And David makes this statement to Saul, and he says, may no one's heart fail on account of him. Your servant will go and fight this Philistine. So he's basically saying, don't worry, guys, I'm here. I'm here to save the day. And it's easy, like, I mean, when he got anointed, he was 15 years old. He got made king at 30. So he couldn't join the army until he was 20. So he's between 20 and 15. Let's say he's 17 at this point. So we've got a 17-year-old kid, and he's like, yeah, don't worry, I got it. Leave it to me. And then Saul rightly says to him, you are not able to go against this Philistine to fight him, but you are only a youth, while he's been a warrior since his youth. And Saul here is right. David hasn't got any fighting experience, as far as Saul knows. He's a young kid. Even if he's fought something, he's never faced battle because he's too young. He's probably a small, kind of scrawny kid. And you got Goliath, who's a massive guy with armor and everything, all the trimmings. And David is kind of adamant that he can do this, but Saul, rightly, I think, judges and says, you're not really cut for this. But David carries on, and he says to Saul, your servant was tending his father's sheep. When a lion or a bear came and took a sheep from the flock, I went out after it and attacked it and rescued the sheep from its mouth. And when it rose up against me, I grabbed it by its mane and struck it and killed it. Your servant has killed both the lion and the bear, and this uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, since he has defied the armies of the living God. So David is adamant. Bearing in mind, a lot is at stake here. So if David loses, not just David is at stake, but the entire nation of Israel is at stake here. Hence why nobody rose up from Israel to go fight Goliath, because no one person in their camp, in their own strength, was able to beat Goliath. But David I don't think he's even thinking about the consequences. He's just outraged, and he wants to go after Goliath. And we know the story. We're kind of familiar with what happens, and is taken David to kind of a mythical level within Christianity and Judaism. And this story, whether you're Christian, non-Christian, you've most probably heard of it. Sorry, I just realized I'm not giving you any cues, but you did a great job. Thank you. So this is the kind of scenario. You've got David versus this lion and the bear. And I find this interesting because I think it's absolutely wild. I think it's absolutely crazy that David was faced with this scenario of the bear and the lion, and somehow in his little brain calculated that this was a good idea. Right? I don't know if anybody has ever thought that before, but to me that's crazy. So I start questioning, what is going on here? Why, most of us, if you're faced with a situation, will kind of make the right judgment and say, okay, a sheep is probably not worth it, right? And I'm assuming, David kind of said that if the lion or a bear come and take the sheep, I'm assuming that they didn't just pick it up and walk away with it. Like, these are predators. Like, they are made to kill. I assume they grabbed it by its neck with the aim to break its neck and take it. They are made for this. So by the time you get the sheep back and he puts this word rescued, I don't think he would have really rescued the sheep. I think he would have just got back a few rounds of kebab at that point. But nevertheless, in David's mind, that was a risk worth taking, and he went after it. Now, if Jesse, his dad, was with him, he would have probably yanked him back and given him a slap around the head and said to him, there's only one of you. There's hundreds of these sheep. And we're not talking about the Jesus kind of sheep. Like, we're just talking about stews here, like many of them. So Jesse would have probably just said to him, you're absolutely crazy. Why would you do that? I've got one son. There's only one of you. There's hundreds of these sheep. That's not a risk worth taking. But Jesse wasn't there. And this is a risk that David took. And he paid off. So after that, and I like to, we don't get any indication that this was the case, but I like to think that this happened after David was anointed with the Spirit of God. Because I couldn't imagine a 15-year-old or a younger kid going against a lion and a bear. These are the top of the food chain. They are made to kill from the moment they are born. They've got the teeth, the fangs, the everything, the muscle. They've got everything. And he's just a kid. He's just a human kid. Even though we can be more vicious in our minds, but even our bodies are not made to kill. But David, in his mind, he kind of saw himself able. And I like to think that was after he was anointed with the Spirit of God. Kind of like a Samson thing going on. That it raged within him and he just went after it. So what's going on here? On the left-hand side, you got the picture of an average human brain. And on the right-hand side, you got the picture of my brain. Hey, no, I'm joking. That's a joke. No, that's the size of basically a newborn baby's brain, and this is an adult size. And actually, it's amazing. By the time somebody's 6 years old, that brain will develop to 90% of the size and capacity of that brain, which is amazing. But this growth doesn't actually stop there. It's physically kind of 90% towards the size of the adult brain, but actually internally it keeps on developing even further past that point. So I'm going to read you something I found on a very trustworthy Google website. Adolescence is a time of significant growth and development inside the teenage brain. The main change is that unused connections in the thinking and processing part of your child's brain, called the gray matter, are pruned away. At the same time, other connections are strengthened. This is the brain's way of becoming more efficient based on the use it or lose it principle. This principle process begins in the back of the brain. The front part of the brain, the prefrontal cortex, is remodeled last. The prefrontal cortex is a decision-making part of the brain, responsible for your child's ability to plan, think about the consequences of actions, solve problems, and control impulses. Changes in this part of the brain continue into early adulthood because the prefrontal cortex is still developing. Teenagers might rely on part of the brain called the amygdala to make decisions and solve problems more than adults do. The amygdala is associated with emotions, impulses, aggression, and instinctive behavior. And amygdala, you might have heard this quite a bit because we have a generation that's really struggling with anxiety, and anxiety is actually that. So what they're referencing, instinctive behavior, I believe, is the fight and flight system. It's the part of the brain that really takes care of the survival aspects of us as humans. And it makes sense for a child to have this part of the brain the most active because they are the weakest, right? They need to think about survival as the primary thing at that age to get away from danger. But something is going on with David. This part of his brain is misfiring, I think. I'm not sure what's going on. Because faced with the risk of going against a lion and a bear, his instinct should tell him to flee. But in David's case, it tells him to fight, which is a really odd thing. And then come to Goliath, the same thing happens again. He's faced with this ginormous task, this undefeatable giant, and he doesn't. His calculation in his brain is, instead of going, okay, that's not for me, it just goes, fight. And that's really interesting to me. Now, I don't know what's going on, but I think if David lived in our time, he would be sent to therapy. I think we will give him a bottle of pills, maybe some antipsychotics, maybe some Ritalin, maybe we'll give him a title, a branding, and we'll put him into a class of ASBO kid, of somebody who's got anger management issues and is unable to control his impulses. His brain is not developing like it should be. Maybe, I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm just roasting the kid for no reason. So what does this all mean for us? Okay, great. David's got A kid's brain that is more likely to take risks. What does that mean for me? Does my age matter? My brain is now fully developed, I like to think. My frontal cortex is working, is active, and is calculating all the risks that are available in my area and is making decisions, I like to think, quite well. So what does that mean? Am I still able to live an amazing life like David did? Because David, rightly or wrongly, took those risks, and they paid off. Whether they made sense or not, that's another issue. But God, I like to think that David, in that moment, even if he wasn't thinking about it in that moment because he's young and there's no one more right than a 19-year-old, as Neil said once, and and it's true, because in his mind, he might have thought, actually, you know what, this is me. I'm a great warrior. I beat a lion and a bear. I can take care of Goliath as well. But David carried on. His story carried on. And later on, when we read the Psalms, you actually realize that he's learned the lesson that he has to rely on God, that it's God that rescues him. So whether he was thinking about this in this moment in his life, or that's a lesson that came afterwards through the experiences of going to war and being in the positions where he was bound to lose, but coming out the other side, he started to learn that actually it's God that's been doing this. Whether he knew at that point doesn't matter. Later on, he learned, and he would have reflected and meditated back on this moment and realized that it was God that was doing it all along. So, does age matter? Yes, it does, but not, I don't think, in the way that we like to think. So I looked at some websites, again, some trustworthy ones I like to think, and looked at some of the biggest regrets among older people. And actually among the top 5 was this: not taking enough risks. That people in their older age didn't think that they took enough risks. Now, if you ask me, as I like to still say I'm youth, but the youth may disagree, but I like to think back in my life in the past 10 years or 20 years and say, actually, you know what? I took a lot of risks, but I took a lot of stupid risks. And I would bet that that's quite common among younger people, that they look back at their lives and think, oh, I shouldn't have done that. That was a wrong decision to make back then. That was a wrong risk to take. So my conclusion of it all is this. That's not it. Young people take more risks. Their brains are kind of haven't developed that way to calculate properly. For better or worse, they take more risks. But older people have more wisdom because they've taken a bunch of risks that didn't pay off. And through those failures, they now have more wisdom. So there's pros and cons to both. But what does that mean for you? Maybe you're a youth, or maybe you're older. I had to really think about that one. But what does that mean for you? And what it means, I think, is this: that wisdom plus risk equals life change. It doesn't matter which side you sit on, whether you're older and you take more calculated risks, if there is such a thing, or you're younger and you need more wisdom. But wisdom and risk together make changes happen. That's the mixture. You can't do one without the other. If you got wisdom and a lot of it, but don't take risks, well, you're just a very wise person. But there's no amazing story there. But if you take loads of risk and you have no wisdom, then you get Samson. But mixed together, you get stories like David. Now, maybe David at this point in his life, when he was 15, 20, didn't quite have the wisdom of his son later on, but he grew in wisdom. You can kind of question that in some of the decisions he makes later on, but we like to think that he had some wisdom. But for us, I think it's significant, because inside this room, there's the two groups that fit within this paradigm. But inside every single one of you, no matter your age, there is a dream of some kind. There is that part of you, whether God has placed it there, maybe it's a dream, maybe it's a business, maybe it's a course you wanted to take, maybe it's a job you wanted to do, but you're not qualified for it. Or doing a course that you don't have the finances for. I don't know what it is, but inside of every single one of us, there is a dream that's too big for us, that's maybe been sat there for years and years and years and years. Or maybe it's just starting to develop. And in order, I think, for us to make most of opportunity of living on this earth is to think about whether you sit in either of these groups, to apply more wisdom if you're trying to make a decision, but also take risks. And mix them together. Take wisdom and risk. And if you haven't got wisdom, ask for it. Because that's what God says to do. Ask and it shall be given to you. And if you haven't got the ability to risk, if your threshold for that sort of thing is low, just go for it. Just make one decision. Take one foot and put it in front of the other and let God come through. Because that's the only way you're going to grow spiritually. You're not going to grow spiritually thinking about this and reading about the stories. You'll become very knowledgeable, but your life will stay the same. You have to take a step. You have to make a move. You have to take a form of a risk, but do it wisely. Oh, there's the last slide. Okay, great. Where are we at? How long was that? Do you guys know? Oh, there we go. Perfect. My work is done. It's been a pleasure seeing you, everybody, and that is the word I have for tonight. I think wisdom and risk are the answers for the question, does age matter? Or at least one of the answers. It's been a pleasure.